without further ado, I am very, very excited to introduce our guest speakers. So both of them will be speaking for about 20 minutes each. And then at the end, as they're speaking, think of the questions you want to ask, because we'll have about 20 minutes for both Oscar and Priti to answer questions. So first up, we have Oscar, who, with his amazing plant collection, is calling in, I believe, from New York City, like myself, right, Oscar?
Yes, from New York City, Washington Heights, to be specific. It is extensive.
Washington Heights, Upper Manhattan, all the way. Me too. And why I really wanted to invite Oscar is because, first of all, such a household name at Solutions Journalism Network. My colleague Alan Arthur interviewed him last year as being just like the go-to person for this very topic, reporting on for and with marginalized communities, as well as an amazing journalist who has so much knowledge, especially of sort of urban economics. I told him he should be a professor of this subject in his abundant free time, I'm sure. And Oscar is going to kick us off, and then the wonderful Priti Salian, who, what time is it, Priti, where you are?
It's 10:35 now, 10:35 p.m.
Oof.
10:35 p.m. taking the late shift for us, calling in from Bangalore, India. Is that right?
That's right.
And Priti, who, like Oscar, has about 40 stories in the tracker, has just reported on so many different communities who are disabled, communities who are lacking access to essential care, from all over the world. So I thought no better pair to speak about this subject than these two. And with that, Oscar, do you want to kick it off?
Sure.
All right.
All right.
And are you good to, is the share screen working?
I'm trying to figure, oh, here it is. Yeah. Great, I can do this.
There we go. Fantastic.
Thing. All right. Great. Well, thank you, Jules, and thanks, SJN, for inviting both of us to be here today. Really appreciate it. I'm so glad you have one journalist from the US and one from abroad, because everything I have to say about this subject is going to be very US centric. And it's not the only place where I think this kind of reporting and journalism, for or with marginalized communities is lacking. I actually worked in international development from 2008 when I graduated from college until 2014, 2015 when I first started writing for Next City. And one of the things that I learned about, I learned from that world. I learned a lot from that experience, and I kind of immersed myself in that world, anticipating that someday I'd want to be a journalist to write about economic development and inequality. And fortunately, that worked out, and I'll talk about how that worked out. And I just know that what I have to say about marginalized communities in the U.S. definitely applies abroad, but I don't have the history or context, or I haven't built the beat around it. And that's really what I want to talk about today, because at Next City, I do have a beat to write about solutions for equitable economic development, or economic development in marginalized communities within the US. And building that beat has really been what has driven, it's without the ability to build the beat, I'm not sure I would have been able to do what I've been able to do over the past couple of years. So really quickly, for those who don't know, and I know at least one of you knows Next City, Emily. Is Emily Nako here? I don't see everyone on there.
She is.
She is, yes. Emily at Next City is our libraries reporter. She's also our reentry program reporter, usually. If you see any story about libraries, those are always very popular on our site, and it's usually Emily's story. So really quickly, Next City, as you can see on the screen, we're taking pictures all the time. We take shorter pieces, longer pieces. We do generally always have a solutions angle to the story. It may not be a full-fledged solutions-oriented story under the sort of SJN definition, in part because sometimes we're writing about a solution or an idea that that someone has just started or just launched, and it hasn't really had time to have an impact yet. So we can't really say, oh, there's been an impact here, and it's not necessarily an idea that anyone else has tried before. So we also can't say, oh, there's someone's done this before in some other city and they've had an impact, and so now they're doing it here. Sometimes that happens, but sometimes not, and sometimes not yet. So, not everything we write necessarily qualifies as solutions oriented, but there's usually a solutions angle to it somewhere. Yeah, you can see more about this is at nextcity.org/pitch if you want to pitch us. We are always taking pitches. And I came to the Next City in 2015 and to write about, well, let me back up and say, like, Next City is a publication that started in 2003. And I got there in 2015, and I got there as an Equitable Cities Fellow, which was a one-year writing fellowship for a journalist of color to write about economic development, equitable economic development, which I define very broadly as economic development that is somehow responsive to or reflective of the needs of historically marginalized communities. That was sort of the beat I had when I got there, and I had to build it. I started from scratch basically. There was one fellow before me, and her work was really what drew me to Next City. And her name is Alexis. She works at ProPublica now, actually, but Alexis Stevens, and that's what She was the first Equitable Cities Fellow, and I really appreciated her work. And so when the next year's fellowship application process rolled out, I immediately applied and just explained how I thought my experience in international development really prepared me to report on this stuff. And so, what is this stuff? Like I mentioned, it's economic development that is responsive to or reflective of the needs of historically marginalized communities. And so I'm talking to people in these neighborhoods who have lived there, who are working there. Maybe they're running businesses there. Maybe they are trying to develop real estate in these neighborhoods. And I want to know in what way is the work that they're doing responding to or reflective of the economic needs of marginalized communities. And that could be, there's all kinds of institutions, right? There's community-based or grassroots organizations in these neighborhoods. There's the funders who are working with them. There are city council members who represent these neighborhoods locally, state and federal policymakers, elected officials who also either represent these neighborhoods or they're working in these neighborhoods. There's the private sector, everyone from lenders, financial institutions, banks, credit unions, other kinds of financial institutions that are working in these neighborhoods. Funders, a lot of this work is funded by foundations, some of the same foundations that actually fund Next City, and we can talk about what that's like, trying to cover work that is funded by a foundation that also funds your work as a media organization. Because Next City is a nonprofit media organization. I didn't say that up front. So we take money from readers and foundations, and we have a little bit of ad revenue, as you can see on our site. And And it's a little bit like the NPR model where we're, a couple times a year, we send a big email out to our readers and we say, hey, we're a nonprofit. Would you like to help us do the work that we do by funding, by donating to us? Anyway, okay, so that's Next City. When I got to Next City, I had to build out a beat, which requires spending a lot of time building relationships. And we're a national publication, so these relationships I had to build and are cut across different cities. They cut across different sectors. They cut across different kinds of organizations. And I had to figure out how to meet them and spend time with them and build relationships with them to understand, what work is going on, what's new or different about this project versus that project. I was able to take a lot of the knowledge I had gained from my previous experience working in international development to understand, like, what is a microloan? What is, how does a bank work? How do capital markets and how do different policies affect the flows of investment across different spaces? A lot of the knowledge I gained from my previous experience and I was able to bring into this job, just to understand at a very basic level, the social network of all the stuff that's happening, right? Like this organization that's doing this work, they maybe they have grants from one place, they have workers from another place, they have a loan from another place. It's based on, they're doing work underneath a zoning policy that may be determined by someone else. There's so much that goes into any given project that I'm writing about or business model that involve more than just that one particular person who's brought this idea to me, who's maybe part of that business or from that neighborhood. They have to, there's a whole social network behind it that constitutes my beat. And I had to take time. I had to go to a lot of conferences, industry conferences, and there's different gatherings of like affordable housing developers or community development lenders or economic development agencies. I went to these conferences sometimes or usually really at my own expense. The fellowship did pay for some travel, so that was nice in the first year to be able to go to some of these conferences with some travel support, and I know SJN also has some travel grants. But I would go not to cover the conference. I would go to meet people and like I said, build my beat and meet all the folks who are involved in any of these projects in any given city. And a national conference of community development lenders is going to bring folks from all over the country working in all these different neighborhoods. And they're going to talk about their work. They're going to ask each other questions about their work. And I'm going to sit in the audience, or I'm going to sit, a lot of times I'm sitting in a restaurant or a bar or a hotel, just having conversations with folks, trying to understand everyone's work and what's interesting and what's important and, what's different about this idea versus that idea. And when I started doing this work at Next City, it was basically after I hung up the phone, I got the news, they offered me the fellowship. And, I did the standard, like, okay, I think I want to say yes, but, give me a night to think it over, but I'll probably say yes. So I hung up the phone, and the next thought I had was, oh my gosh, I will be reporting on economic developments in marginalized communities across the United States. I need to make sure I need to make sure my reporting is representative of those communities. And so I made a giant spreadsheet, or I made a spreadsheet. It wasn't giant at first, but eventually became giant, to track the race and gender of everyone I interviewed and quoted as a source in all of my stories. And I've been doing it informally. And informally to me means I don't always get to ask, and I don't always know for sure. Like, I may not have met this person, so I may have to look them up on LinkedIn. Sometimes it does come up, if I'm talking about a story about how this organization has figured out a way to overcome redlining and segregation in some way, or to respond to it, it's going to come up. Like, I'm a Black person living in this Black neighborhood. I'm the third generation resident, and it comes up. Sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, the point is I keep track of it informally myself in a giant spreadsheet. And so this is where, and I also started, so this is on Twitter, right? I usually share these a couple times a year. I share the update. And yeah, I've been doing this since I started at Next City in 2015. And we can talk more about this if you want. But you know, the point is, I'm reporting about marginalized communities. I want to be sure I'm not missing out on those perspectives in some way. And you know, the city, a lot of cities are majority people of color. You can see the majority of my sources have been people of color. Only 25% of my sources have been, actually it's 20% now, have been white men, and you know, white men who are traditionally overrepresented in media sources. So this is something I tracked, and you know, I don't set benchmarks, so I don't have goals. I'm not trying to change these numbers necessarily every year. How I think about them is I share these numbers occasionally so that folks can hold me accountable, and I can hold myself accountable to say, like, oh, if I'm missing any perspective here or there, please let me know. But here's a starting point for the conversation. Like, I have the starting point of a conversation for people to hold me accountable for being representative in my reporting. And in order to navigate those spaces, so this is where the tips part come in. In order to navigate all those conferences or these neighborhoods, you know, when I go to a conference, it's usually in a different city, you know, whether it's the Bay Area or Atlanta or Detroit or the Twin Cities or St. Louis or New Orleans. All these places I visited over the past few years to attend a conference. I usually ask for a media. They usually let you in for free if you're a journalist. And again, I'm not covering the conference. I'm just there to meet people, and they're very accommodating to kind of let me in, even though I'm not actually writing about the conference. And I tell them that up front. I'm like, I'm not writing about the conference, but I'd like to come and meet folks and see what's up. But I do pay for the travel to like stay, and usually, you know, there's in Chicago, I'm staying on a friend's couch. In the Bay Area, I'm staying on a friend's couch. I haven't been to LA very much, but I have family in LA, so you know, I would stay at their house if I'm in LA. In order to navigate these neighborhoods and these spaces, there's a couple concepts that I'd want to leave you with. Again, these are, in some ways these are universal, but in some ways these are also very particular to the U.S. And so the first thing is, in a marginalized community, can you see the slides, by the way? I don't know if okay. So in a marginalized community, the first thing you understand is there's a whole history of how that neighborhood or that population, if it's an immigrant population, how they became marginalized, right? They weren't marginalized. There's people aren't born, or I mean, they're born in a marginalized community, but they're not marginalized because they're lazy, or you know, they're not poor, or they don't get business loans, or they're denied business loans. They're not denied business loans because they're bad at running businesses. You know, there's systemic racism that filters into all of that. I have here, this is The Color of Law. This is the history of redlining and segregation in the United States. This book came out a couple of years ago. You know, it wasn't around when I first started doing this reporting. I wish it was, but it wasn't. But now it's around, and it's available as a resource for you to understand, for anyone to understand segregation and redlining, how it happened. It was a combination of public and private practices at the local, state, and federal levels that really combined and you know, created what we see today in cities, where we have these very segregated neighborhoods, and the Black and Latino neighborhoods, immigrant neighborhoods are all poor, and the white neighborhoods are all wealthy. There's a reason and a history of how for that this book is very, very powerful and I think succinct capturing of that history. And so, that's something to understand. And, I'll bring up in the reporting examples of like, okay, so once I know that, once I understand that, how does that drive the reporting? The other thing to understand, there's one piece that's missing, I would say, from this book. It's touched on, but it's not really dived into deeply. And it's how do we change slides here? Oh, here we go. And it's the concept of agency, right? Oops, sorry. So how all the Black folks, Hispanic folks, but in particular the Black folks who lived in red line neighborhoods, where did they come from, and how did they end up in those neighborhoods? Why did they end up? Why did they even keep coming to these neighborhoods, even as the redlining was happening? And the concept of agency is seeing the story of marginalization, of segregation, and redlining, seeing it from the other side, seeing it from the perspective of the marginalized. So like the fact before the Great Migration, 90% of Black people in the U.S. lived in the South, and by the end of the Great Migration in the 1970s, half, the majority-ish of Black folks lived outside of the South in the U.S., and that shift drove everything in the color of law. Like Black folks coming to cities in the North started racialized segregation by zoning and by real estate discrimination, which later became redlining, which later became disinvestment, because Black folks were made to live in these neighborhoods. They were denied the loans to own and maintain the buildings, and the buildings started falling apart, and that's disinvestment. And now you can't. Now you're living in a neighborhood that's literally falling to pieces physically, even though the people and the culture are very vibrant and strong and powerful. Right? The buildings are falling apart. But where else would you go? These were the neighborhoods where you were allowed to live as a Black person or a Hispanic person in the U.S. Right? That whole story behind leaving the South, and we're talking about the descendants of folks descended from slavery, the tremendous calculation and hard decisions that had to be made to leave the South and go somewhere to the North, and the place where you end up. It was the only places you were allowed to live. So you made the best of it. That whole ability to make that decision. I think a lot of reporting, not just about problems, but also solutions, we lose the agency of the marginalized community, the ability of someone who's living that to make hard decisions, have a perspective, make a hard choice, and do something about their situation, whether it's move to another neighborhood, or if you're in that neighborhood, it's to do something in that neighborhood to improve the situation. And one of the first lines in the book that really hit me hard in The Warmth of Other Suns, it's very early in the book, where Isabel Wilkerson says, "The Great Migration was the first big step the nation's working class ever took without asking permission first." Right? The first big step the nation's working class ever took without asking permission first. All these folks who left the South made tough decisions to do something to better their situation. At the time, it was, we're leaving the South. We're going to some strange city where we might know 2 or 3 people. We might not know anybody, and we're going to go and try to figure it out. Right. And this is a story. This is a global story too, right? I don't have the historical context to give you, but like it's partly my family story, right? Like I'm Filipino. My family immigrated from the Philippines in the 70s and 80s, and there's a migration story there. But the point is, people who live in these neighborhoods aren't just waiting. They're not just damsels in distress waiting for a savior to come and fix everything. They're doing something, and that something that they're doing is worth reporting on. And that's what I'm always looking for. That I can't say it happens in every story, but that's what I'm always looking for. The folks who are living in these neighborhoods, what are they doing in terms of economic development to better their situation? Now that said, the last concept I would want to leave you with is the concept of extraction. So even though the people who live and work in historically marginalized communities in the US, even though they have the agency to do something about their situation, they didn't, that situation that they're in isn't entirely their fault, right? It's systemic. It's bigger than them. It was caused as a result of various layers of federal and policies, state policies, local policies, and the private sector. The burden of fixing all that, like it can't fall entirely on the shoulders of the folks in these communities. And this book by Marisa Baradaran, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap, is about how, after the Civil War, through Reconstruction, all the way up till today, Black communities have been trying to invest in themselves. They've been putting their money into Black-owned banks. They've been doing all the things that you still hear today that are spending money on Black-owned businesses. They've been doing all that, but it's done nothing to the racial wealth gap. And there's many reasons why. And this book provides a history of why. And at the end of the book, the point is, as Marisa says it herself in this book, at the end of the book, the burden of closing this cannot fall entirely on the shoulders of Black communities in the US. It's systemic. The wealth has been extracted from Black communities, whether it was slavery first or various forms of exploitative labor arrangements later on. That is all part of the history of extraction. So a lot of the story that I get to write about is actually about how the folks in these communities brought everyone else in line with their vision, whether it's a vision of how to manage money, how to manage real estate, how to run a business, how to operate and manage a business, what's the ownership structure of a business. A lot of the story I get to write about is actually, you had this idea to run this worker-owned business in this neighborhood. How did you get everyone else aligned to help finance that business? This is a story, I'll put the link in the chat, but this is a story, the headline was worker cooperatives are building their own investment network because worker cooperative businesses don't fit into into the standard lender boxes for a number of reasons. They're building their own, and most, if not all of the money in every loan that this network is able to produce comes from somewhere else in the economic system. Wealthy individuals, foundations, the money comes from somewhere else. But the way that money gets invested, the structure of the business, everything, the fact that this business is getting investment at all, that decision has been made inside these communities. And some of the story is, how did you convince those other people to trust you to invest this money? This is another story. I'll skip ahead to this one for now. Oh, so this is another one. This is similar in terms of folks in a historically disinvested community in Oakland. How did you figure out a way to manage real estate and land in a cooperative fashion? How did you convince everyone else to invest in that model? And you can see explicitly here, when I ask, why is this neighborhood important? Why do it in this neighborhood? And I knew this source, or had the story of like, well, this is the neighborhood where my grandparents moved to during the Great Migration. And so that's why it's important for us to protect and maintain our lives in these neighborhoods, because this was it. Like we left the South because of Jim Crow. We came here. It was still messed up when we got here. This is where we're going to make our stand. And this is how we're going to do it with this really strange kind of real estate cooperative. So I think I've already taken up more than my time, and I know I'm hoping to get some questions from you guys, but I hope that's been helpful to you all to understand what I've been doing over the past couple of years.
Fantastic. Oscar, thank you so much. In case you can't tell, the chat is really popping with lots of questions and hope to ask you questions at the end. Yeah, I do just want to make sure we have time for Priti to give a presentation, but everyone save those great questions for the very end. And Oscar's also, we're going to share the stories he didn't get to talk about in a follow-up email. So Priti, over to you.
Hi, I'll just share my screen.
Fantastic. There we go. Great.
Nice. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, great. So, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know what time of the day it is for you, but for me, it is time to say good night. But thanks to Oscar's very interesting presentation, I'm wide awake to conduct my own. So thank you, Oscar. Let me tell you a bit about myself. I'm an independent journalist based out of Bangalore and have reported mostly from India, but also a little from Germany and Uganda on various marginalized communities, including people with disabilities, LGBTQ people, sex workers and their daughters, slum dwellers, acid attack survivors, children living on the streets, and many more. I'm thrilled to be in the company of such capable journalists who root for the solutions journalism approach. I love it myself. I've written most extensively and consistently on the disability community, so I would mostly be citing my experiences and learnings with them in my presentation, which I hope are of help to you. One of the most critical things is to spend as much time as possible with the community you want to write about. There is absolutely no substitute for leisurely meetings, so create opportunities to meet. Attend events of common interest, which will give you a chance to chat about stuff that you wouldn't discuss in a focused phone interview. And believe me, it'll not only be great for your article, but also for your general knowledge and general interest. I learned quite a few things about persons with disabilities during such meetings, casual meetings. I mean, now when I think of it, they are all common sense, yet unknown to someone who hasn't interacted with this heterogeneous community. So just to give you just to give you 2-3 examples, a wheelchair liberates; it doesn't confine. There's a difference between the perceptions of someone who's born blind and who's, who goes blind later in life. Do not help a person unless asked. And the next step is to ask how they would like to be assisted. One of my first story ideas, which was about struggles people with disabilities face in finding a partner, also came to me while I was at an inclusive event. It was organized by a dating app that is unfortunately not operational anymore in India or anywhere for that matter. So it was easy for me at that point of time to find people willing to talk to me about dating and finding a partner. My article about sexuality education for blind women also emerged from a workshop I had attended. I conducted interviews right after, asking participants questions based on their comments and their questions during the training. So it was easy for them to open up to me at that time, which I'm certain wouldn't have happened had I just approached them for a story on the topic. So being together in diverse situations can definitely give you opportunities to talk about various things. And then Meeting in community spaces or a person's home or workplace will give you clues about their lifestyle. For someone like me who's a fan of narrative journalism, observing people in different settings is very important. Joining Facebook, WhatsApp, or other community chat groups is a big plus, as they give you a peek into some interesting and insightful conversations that can help you understand a person's life well. Discussions about advocacy, about policy, and other global issues also abound in such groups. So if you can get an in, grab it. So once you've set up the interview and are meeting someone, you would think, what should you do now? Being empathetic and respectful is enough, I think. So adjust your body language to reflect genuine interest. Apply different tools for different people. Sometimes it's about finding common ground. At others, it's just about being sensitive to their needs. So when I went to cover the story of a group of teenage girls in a Mumbai slum, I wasn't sure of the reception I would get. The story portrayed two important things. One is how they have used football to break stereotypes, such as it's a male-dominated sport, and how they've convinced their parents to let them play in public spaces. The slum they call home was at that time, and I think even now, known for breeding crime and breeding terrorists. So I was certain that as an outsider, they would be wary of me, wary of the fact that I may be coming with some preconceived notions. So as soon as I met them, I said, okay, hi. And I announced that I have a daughter about their age, and just chatted with them about her. And that was enough to break the ice. After that, they just didn't stop talking. At the end of my 3 hours with them, I had a good understanding of the slice of their life that I wanted for the story. And later, of course, we even kicked the ball around together. Once when I went to meet HIV positive women, I shook hands with them while being introduced, and that helped them relax. The gesture spoke to them, and they probably understood that I'm well informed and wouldn't discriminate against them because of the virus they carry. In India, sometimes I address my elderly sources as uncles and aunties, and this worked in Germany too. While you're at the interview, don't cut to the chase immediately. Get to sensitive questions after establishing a rapport. I check my interviewees' social media accounts before the interview and ask them something relevant based on that. Sometimes I just appreciate something they have done recently or ask them more about it. I also let them relax by giving them some leeway. I tell them while I'm recording this interview, if they need to go off the record about something, they can let me know. Then I also don't show them I'm in a hurry. I know it can be painful at times for journalists when people go on and on. But for me personally, it's okay because I believe and do slow journalism, but it doesn't have to be okay for you. If you just casually say that you have a lot of time in hand since your next meeting is at 4 p.m., people would get the hint and it wouldn't sound like you're in a hurry. Then find an alternative interviewee for sensitive information. For instance, it is thoughtless to ask a mother what the life expectancy of her terminally ill child could be. Ask the doctor instead. For someone living with a disability, I do a search on the issue instead of asking them questions about their illness or disability directly. Sometimes family members, friends, others who know my sources fill these information gaps for me. But of course, I only ask them factual, I only take factual information from them. which is difficult to ask my source directly. While writing, I guess, frame sentences in a sensitive manner, say life-threatening illness in your article instead of no one with X illness has lived beyond 12 years or something like that. And one thing that I do is always write a note to my editor about how I would like some things to be addressed. So while they're in the story, they may just get edited out or sometimes rephrased, and the editor may not take note of it. So I just write an extra note in the email while making my submission, while filing my story. It's helpful to read up on the global context of the problem, even while reporting local. My knowledge about using the correct language, especially for persons with disabilities and queer people, came from following the work of advocates worldwide and reading other global pieces on similar issues. Such reading is also useful in understanding the deficit in your country and also what the process of achieving certain goals could be. For example, while recently reporting on rare diseases, I learned that the origin of all research and development of drugs for such diseases across the world began with patients' organizations. They often take it upon themselves to initiate the a fund for drug research, since governments are mostly reluctant to invest in such small groups of patients. I mean, they have bigger things to think about, like tuberculosis and cancer and other things. And that fact really helped me contextualize the rare disease movement in India. Then, of course, find diverse voices. All of us know that, and we do it for all our stories. Sometimes finding new people to interview from the community can change the narrative. So always make that a priority. I have tried the linear snowball sampling technique, where each of my sources recommends another that could meet my requirements for the story. This ensures that I don't get all my characters for the story from one person. Of course, I always end up interviewing many more than I can quote. And this is something that needs to be explained to your sources as soon as you approach them, if you don't want to land into trouble. Ask instead of assuming. An exiled journalist I interviewed for a piece about a publication run by refugees for refugees didn't want to be associated with the word refugee at all. So I omitted that info about her. And I'm sure you must have faced this many times. Some people like to stay anonymous, but I've found that if you give them options, such as using their first name or omitting specific info about their location, age, or profession, they would agree. So that's a way to persuade them. I've found success in. Likewise, some people do not understand the consequences of what they say. Once a young deaf girl mentioned that she cheated through her undergraduate course exams to pass, and was quite open about it. She told me, you can mention, please go ahead and mention it in the story. I want everybody to know this is how we grow up in India. I decided to omit the info, thinking it might affect her job prospects adversely. As journalists, I think we need to keep in mind that the story we do doesn't harm a person. It should be for the larger good of the society. So sometimes you happen to forge relationships with your sources, but even when you don't, it's a good idea to keep in touch. Once you write about a community, you're likely to get further ideas from them. So keep asking what they would like to see covered, the gaps they find in media reports, etc. Sometimes a rudimentary idea may have been fully developed elsewhere, so ask during your interview. I was covering a story on aging in one city in Germany and found that they were trying out the same solution which was fully fleshed out in another. So I traveled and got a fine story about a Berlin hospital that is modifying itself to prevent delirium among dementia patients. My lead for a piece about the launch of an audio description app came from a disability support organization I had worked with before. Sometimes interviews with marginalized and underprivileged communities can pose barriers. People do not own phones, they don't have access to data or Wi-Fi, or sometimes their internet is very slow. And it's especially true in India. Sometimes there's a language barrier. So there are so many things. Then there are also emotional barriers. As a person with severe disability, opening about your struggles of finding a partner can be painful when you know that the situation may never change for you. For this story that I wrote for The Guardian, I had to divide my conversations over various meetings and calls. I found that sharing was much easier when I was with two friends who knew each other well and trusted each other. And we formed a small focus group of sorts to do that. Once, a guy who lives with cerebral palsy told me that he fell in love with a girl because she did not help him pick up a cookie on the plate while they were at a cafe. Now, this surprised and pleased him because usually when he takes almost a minute to pick up something and take it to his mouth, due to poor hand-mouth coordination, his companions just assume he needs assistance and provide him that assistance. So that's the kind of patience you need with a person with disability, he told me. I've used that lesson many times, and it came handy when I interviewed people who stutter for a story recently. So don't push work at their pace. I always remind myself that it takes a lot to share oneself with others, especially the painful parts of your life. Ideally, I do feature stories of with communities before delving into news pieces, because I feel that for the first story, I should be taking more time and I should be giving them more time, learn more about them before I can do a quick news piece with them.
Priti, this is so fantastic. And I know it's ironic on a slide about patience to try to just to be mindful of the clock. People are loving these tips, and I'm thinking maybe we could spend the last 10 minutes just hearing some questions from the audience. If you want to just wrap up with this one.
Sure. So it's okay. Yeah, let's go ahead with the questions now. So I'll just stop sharing.
Wonderful.
Great, I understand.
Priti, everyone is loving, and Oscar, there's just so many great tips here. And I want to toss it over to the group. Anyone can feel free to unmute and ask a question in the 8 minutes we have left. So I think, Natalie, you had a question.
Yeah, just a kind of general one that would be great to have both of you answer, that I think will be a good starting off point. A lot of this advice and tips about connection building and rapport building has definitely been somewhat stifled by the pandemic, and especially when working with marginalized communities, that's exacerbated by not having the same access to technology. So what has that source cultivation and connection building looked like for both of you during the pandemic?
Oscar, you want to take that first?
Sure. I think the main thing that changed is I've relied more than usual on pre-existing relationships I've had. And it was a little scary at first, maybe not at first, but it was a little scary maybe in September or October. I don't know, it felt like things were kind of drying up. But the way because usually these conferences that I go to is where I'll meet the new people. I'll be sitting in a hotel bar talking to somebody I've interviewed before, and like three other people I don't know, but they know them. They'll walk up to us and it'll be like, "Oh, what do you do?" And they'll tell me everything, and I'll ask a bunch of questions, and then they'll say, "Oh, what do you do, Oscar?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm a reporter. Can we make this interview on the record, or do you want to do this again tomorrow on the record?" And that part, sort of a longer range view, has been delayed, and starting to pick it back up slowly. But I have also noticed that a lot of the stories that I would consider follow-up stories to like stories from like 2 or 3 years ago, those are starting to come back into the picture. I guess I would say maybe I'm more worried about what things will look like for me maybe at the end of this year, if like those like random connections don't start to pick back up again. Those have been kind of falling off the cliff. Yeah.
I've relied a lot on video interviews in the last year, but frankly, I'm getting frustrated now. It's so recently, in fact, I went out to a hospital for a story on rare diseases. I didn't need to, but I just wanted to see that place, and I just took the risk. So I guess it's my frustration that's coming out now. But on the brighter side, fortunately for me, I had a lot of stories which were already reported. I had made 2 trips, one to Germany and one to Uganda in 2019, and I had a lot of stories in my kitty, so I just had to do some follow-ups, and I could write, and so it worked out that way to a large extent. But yes, I have relied on video interviews. There's been no other way for me.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Ambika, did you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, I specifically had a question, not just about, I work in a lot of communities, slum dwellers in India, and like communities across South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and as well as marginalized communities in the US. I not so much asking the question about how to write the story, but what I have often found in international communities is that when I enter them, there's like sort of an earnestness in terms of like, because they have so little international media representation. And so writing a story about like a specific community in Bangalore, for example, is usually there, I can form the relationships fairly fast. And then when people read the story, they know very well that like, I'm not someone from that community, but there's this like, I guess either there's not so much antagonism about me for readers. I'm not talking specifically about the community, but readers who are reading that story. What I find often in the US context, I'm currently writing a story right now about Black farmers. I have inroads to Black farmers and I have community stuff, but because the topic of Black farmers is so heavily like in the social justice movement in the US right now, and it's such a hot topic, even though that community has been around forever. There's this real feeling when you read something that's not from that community as a reader, that it feels like you're being an imposter. So I'm curious how you guys deal with it, not from the people who you've made the relationships with, because I understand that relationship building, but from your audience and readership. How do you sort of allow them to read that story with a feeling that you have done that work and that you're coming from an authentic place, specifically for domestic stories, US stories?
So
I guess.
okay, Oscar, go ahead.
I'm good. I cut you off. Go ahead. Yeah. So I guess you're asking if how do I deal with the potential for someone like outside, like other Black farmers, maybe who are reading this in other places, who might be worried that this reporting is coming from something that's perspective that's exploitative, or
Or even not maybe Black farmers, but anyone in the Black community or social justice community, or anyone who's a farmer who's a person of color. Like, how do you gain trust with your readership, not just with the people that you're talking about?
I think about it a lot, and I guess I don't talk about it a lot, but one of the things I tend to do is, if I'm going to a new city, like let's say Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, for instance, and if I'm writing about a particular neighborhood, I usually go to Chicago once a year, and I try to visit the neighborhood if I want to write about it, if I know there's some stories there, and I make connections. And I guess the sources you pick, the angles you take on a story, if you've done the homework of understanding the historical context, everything from both the systemic systems of repression, how they came to be, the degree of agency that's present in any given story, and the degree to which extraction has occurred, and this particular idea, this solution, is trying to address all of that. What's really helped me do that is actually going to these communities, and let's say like they're having a neighborhood meeting about a project that maybe I want to write about, maybe I don't want to write about it after I go to that meeting, or if I'm going to a conference and I'm listening to the questions that they have about whatever is the subject of the conversation, whether it's a project, a policy. So for Black farmers, I mean, I would be trying to attend a lot of these, if there's virtual events now that are happening, I want to attend those. And I do spend a lot of time listening to the questions that they have for each other about whatever it is we're talking about, whether it's a new model of ownership, a new policy. I think if I know that they have these questions, and I don't necessarily think they're being answered in this conversation, or it's tough to know for sure if I'm building that trust, but I know that when I come back to those communities later to do a story, and I run into people who read something I wrote about, something else in their neighborhood. I also get that feedback sometimes on email. It's something definitely to think about and worry about. And I guess what I do to mitigate against that feeling is I'm trying to keep informed and in touch with people in that community somehow, whether it's their own virtual events or like having lots of background conversations. I mean, I text, I don't know if, I text a lot of sources, or sometimes it's DMs on Facebook or Twitter, just about stuff that, if I have a question about a policy, I think having a beat is part of what helps go past the transactional kind of feeling of reporting. Them knowing that I may not write about them right now, but this relationship matters, and it helps me. I mean, they certainly know, and I tell them a lot, like, I come to this conference to listen to the audience questions, because I want to know what you all want to know, and I want to be able to adjust that as a reporter. I don't know if I'm rambling on here. I know we're over time, but I hope that's helpful.
These are such great insights. Priti, did you want to add anything to that?
I would say of course, like Oscar said, do your homework well, even if you're, community for the first time. And what I do is that I run my, after writing the story, I either discuss it with someone who is probably not related to the story, but is part of the community, a leader, an advocate or something. And I see if the questions that my story is answering are kind of okay, if if he agrees, if he or she agrees with it. So I do that with a couple of people, and if I'm in a different country, or if I'm in a city that I haven't been to before, or I try to find local journalists who could also verify some of the information, because there are cultural aspects which may just slip past, and I may not really be knowing everything about a country or about a community that I haven't reported on before. So I try to do those kind of things, yes. And finally, of course, it's also the editor's job and the publication's job to do some fact checking, and I'm sure they have their own people. There are a whole lot of publications who have correspondents in different countries and different cities, and who vet the information. Yes.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Priti, thank you so much. Oscar, thank you so much. I know we're over time, and I really want to respect your time and all the prep you did for this. As you can see, the chat is really just going off with great discussions and insights that you've helped to stimulate. There is a little bit of a thread and a question about compensating sources, but I totally understand if you have to leave. If anyone wants to stay on for just another 2 minutes or so to talk about that, you're welcome to. But anyone who has to go, thank you so much, Priti and Oscar. You're setting the bar high. I don't know. This is a tough act to follow with these workshops.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jules, for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And as we said, these stories are going to be in a follow-up email and blog post, and especially for those of you who are building newsrooms that are aiming to do this kind of reporting, this will be a great resource to share with your team members. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Fantastic.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
said
so
there
much.
was a
Yeah, go ahead.
something about paying sources you wanted to talk about. I can stay on for a little more if you want.
Sure, that would be great. Yeah, there's just kind of a thread about that relationship between paying not just sources, but fixers, people who are ultimately really crucial in helping to structure the story. And if either of you have any thoughts on that, please do share.
Actually, I did. That was one of my points, which I missed. So I can only talk about my own experience, and I haven't read the messages in the chat. I haven't been able to, but when Oscar was talking, there was a question about US being the, everything. What was it? I don't remember. About that the US truths are universal and it is the default country in the world. So regarding my experience with
saying that.
Hi. So yes. So maybe I can comment on that as well with this point. I went to Uganda. I don't know if Caleb is still around. Caleb, are you around?
I think Caleb might have signed off.
Oh, okay. So I went to Uganda in 2019, end of 2019, and I met him as well. And he knows about this. I wasn't prepared for this. I didn't know this is going to happen. So when I went there, and I was all set to go and meet people for my own story, for my first story. And I mean, I was in touch with an NGO, and the director said, I first want to meet you in a cafe. So I said, okay. And he's a white man, by the way, just want to make that clear. And he said that you should not go to the communities because these people are not going to be comfortable. They'll just not feel comfortable talking to you in those spaces. So what we'll do is we'll call them, we'll organize a meeting in the NGO premises for you. But you will have to pay a certain amount, I mean, which was quite a large amount. Then he didn't explain why. So I was like, what? I've never done that before. So he said, no, so we should not keep talking if that is what you think. I don't think you can do this. So I asked him why he was asking me for money. And he said, I'm not going to take the money. The money will go to them directly. You can pay them directly, but it is for their time. They are going to, a lot of them are daily wage workers, and they're going to come there and they're going to give you time. They will miss their wages for half a day or something. They need lunch. They need to spend on transport to reach there. So I said, I thought for a minute and I said, okay, let's do it. So he's right. Why should they spend on my story? I'm going to earn through the story. So why should they spend? I should compensate them. I did. And then I went on to do another story, and the same thing came up, though the amount was way lesser than what I paid to this group. And one of the local journalists there, and whom I knew, of course, Caleb is somebody I met later, but she told me that she raised a red flag and said that the first director of the NGO was asking you for a lot of money. It's way more than transport and cost for a meal, etc. So I said, okay. I had already paid them, and then I did it for the second group as well. That is because I wasn't better informed. This is not done with local journalists. I found out later they never ask local journalists for money for interviews. But since I was a foreign journalist, and it's a thing, I believe it's a thing. A lot of people in not only Uganda, but in a lot of other regions, and probably even in India. I don't know about it because they never asked me, because I'm local. Do it. I've heard it's a thing. But should we do it or not do it is something I would rather ask my editor of the publication that gives me an assignment, or maybe a fellowship that backs me for this. So unfortunately, I haven't written those two stories yet, because I was really thrown, and I didn't know what to do about it. But whenever I do, and if I do, I would discuss it with my editor, and I would just tell them this is what happened. So regarding, I also had this discussion with someone else, and they said, why should people not be compensated if they are spending time, traveling all the way to meet you for your story? But I believe that it's not. It's part of code of ethics in the US not to pay your sources, and there are no exceptions made. This is what I've heard. I'm not sure if it's true. So that's how we try to follow what the US says instead of going out and thinking that these communities are poor. Finally, that is what is driving them to ask for money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've never had experience in that situation where I was expected to pay a source. I don't think. Yeah, and I've never had to do that. I think it's sometimes common in like broadcast journalism. If you want an exclusive on a story, and maybe there's something the broadcast station will pay, like this person to only tell them I've heard of that happening in the US, but yeah, I've only been in print or online, and I've never been in that situation. I don't find it's been the expectation. Yeah, even when it comes to marginalized communities. And you know, I think it also gets to something, because maybe you're also touching on this too, like you also want to be wary of, like, if you're taking a farmer's time, that's literally time away from them farming, like producing labor. It's, but you can't pay them. So I guess, how would I deal with this? Well, sometimes that's why, like, sometimes maybe the executive director or like the owner of the business is like, okay, so you want to talk to some of my workers about this? And I'm like, okay, so who do you want to talk to? I'm like, well, whoever has the time. I mean, I don't want to, like, I'm just like, if you got time, great. If not, if you got 10 minutes for me, I'll take 10 minutes. If you got, I mean, I don't know, like, there are interviews I've had that have been like 3 or 4 hours long, but most of them are 30 minutes max, 45, maybe an hour if it's a more complex kind of story. And yeah, it's something I'm very wary of, is taking up someone's time for a story. And I'm always like, some people, it's funny, sometimes people will have a debate about, scheduling, like, how do you schedule time resources? Like, I try to work around their schedule, like, whatever, because I'm trying not to, you know, if you've got to talk at 5 a.m., 5 in the morning your time, then, and it's 5 in the morning my time, fine. I mean, because yeah, I'm not paying you, and I realize, you know, that's also a good way to end the interview. Sometimes I say, all right, well, I think I've taken up a month of your time. I'm going to let you get back to your real job. Thank you for talking to me for this 30 minutes or 45 minutes. I realize this is not compensated. Technically this time that you're giving to me as a source.
Yeah, I'll just say, Jules, do you mind if I just say something real quick?
Yeah,
Just
go for
that that the only way I've gotten around the ethics questions, because the ethics question is really huge, because then it becomes almost like they're doing a commercial, or that you're actually paying them for their words, especially if it's something, an advocacy article or something, a point that you're trying to make. The only way I've gone around that is if I pay their employer. So if I'm working with, like, I've done a lot of work with, like, HIV orphans, and so I will actually contribute to the orphanage, so that people who I'm actually working with have no idea that they've been paid or supplied through me. And so same thing, like, they will send them on the transport, they will send them with the food, so that I don't look like I've actually paid for it. So we'll go through the intermediary party, and that's the one way that that I've been able to sort of do that, because especially in, like, other countries, like, that's their day, like, that's their day labor, like, they can't work that day. And so it's like, what are you going to do about it? So I will pay the organization that's put me in touch with them, and then they will be like, here's your day rate, but they won't say that that's coming from me. And that's how I've been able to negotiate through it.
And publications have been okay with this?
It's mostly for my independent, it's mostly for independent broadcast work, which goes back to what Oscar is saying. So it's mostly for video work and things like that. I think with publications and editors, it's nearly impossible. But when you're doing video work, especially because it is very, very time consuming, you can't do a 30-minute interview even if you want to. You generally have to find some way to pay for at least meals and transport. And I usually go through intermediary organizations for that.
Fantastic. I know we're way over, so again, Oscar, Priti, thank you so much. We really couldn't have asked for two better people to guide this really important discussion. And some of you, I'll see you in an hour for our cohort call. So take care.
Thanks, guys.
Again, and yes, we'll be in touch soon with the blog post as well, because that's going to be so key for keeping these insights top of mind. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.